My boss called me a worthless dumbass. A month later, he regretted it. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Emma sat at her desk, staring blankly at the screen in front of her. The office was alive with its usual chaos, phones ringing, keyboards clacking, and voices overlapping in a symphony of corporate life. But none of that mattered to her right now. Her chest felt tight, like an invisible hand was squeezing it, making it hard to breathe. She replayed his words over and over again in her mind, "You're a worthless dumbass." They echoed louder than any noise around her, cutting deeper than she thought possible. It had happened just moments ago during their weekly team meeting. Emma had been presenting her progress on the company's new marketing campaign, a project she'd poured weeks of effort into. She believed in what she'd created, even if it wasn't perfect yet. But when her boss, Mr. Harrison, interrupted her mid-presentation to tear apart every idea she'd proposed, something inside her shattered. His voice had risen above everyone else's until the entire room fell silent, his eyes piercing through her like daggers. "Do you even know what you're doing?" he sneered before delivering the final blow. "Honestly, I don't know why we keep people like you around." Emma didn't cry then, not in front of him or anyone else. Instead, she forced herself to finish the presentation, her hands trembling so badly she could barely click through her slides. When the meeting ended, she returned to her desk, where she now sat frozen, trying to process what had just happened. She'd always known Mr. Harrison was demanding. From day one, he made it clear that perfection was the only acceptable standard. Mistakes weren't tolerated, they were punished. But this was different. This wasn't constructive criticism meant to push her to improve. This was cruelty disguised as feedback, delivered without a shred of empathy. And for the first time since starting this job 2 years ago, Emma questioned whether she belonged here at all. That evening, Emma walked home under a sky painted orange and pink by the setting sun. Normally, she loved this time of day, the way the world seemed softer, quieter, more forgiving. But today, nothing felt comforting. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though gravity itself conspired against her. By the time she reached her small apartment, tears she'd managed to hold back all afternoon finally spilled over. Sinking onto her couch, she pulled her knees to her chest and let herself cry. It wasn't just about what Mr. Harrison had said, it was everything. The late nights spent working on projects no one appreciated, the constant pressure to prove herself, the gnawing fear that maybe he was right. Maybe she was worthless. But as the hours passed and exhaustion began to outweigh her emotions, a spark of defiance flickered within her. She wiped her face, took a deep breath, and stood up. If Mr. Harrison wanted perfection, fine. She would give it to him, but not because he demanded it. She would do it for herself. For the first time in a long time, Emma resolved to take control of her narrative. Over the next few days, she threw herself into her work with renewed determination. Every task became an opportunity to prove to herself that she was capable, talented, and worthy. She stayed late at the office, poring over data and refining strategies. She sought advice from colleagues whose skills she admired, humbling herself enough to ask questions she'd once been too proud to admit she didn't know the answers to. Slowly but surely, pieces of the puzzle began falling into place. One afternoon, while brainstorming ideas for a client pitch, inspiration struck. An idea formed in her mind, an unconventional approach that combined storytelling with interactive media. It was risky, bold, and unlike anything the company had ever tried before. Part of her hesitated, fearing rejection or ridicule. But another part, the part that had grown stronger these past few weeks, urged her to trust herself. So, she pitched it to her team. To her surprise, they loved it. Even Sarah, the notoriously critical senior designer, nodded approvingly. This could actually work, she said, a rare smile breaking across her face. Encouraged by their support, Emma worked tirelessly to flesh out the concept, ensuring every detail was flawless. For the first time in months, she felt a sense of pride in her work, not because someone else told her she should, but because she genuinely believed in it. When the day came to present the idea to Mr. Harrison, Emma entered his office with her head held high. Gone was the timid woman who'd crumbled under his harsh words weeks earlier. In her place stood someone stronger, surer, unafraid to stand by her vision. As she laid out her proposal, she watched his expression shift from skepticism to intrigue. By the end, he leaned back in his chair, studying her with an intensity that made her heart race. "Impressive," he said finally, his tone measured. "I'll admit, I didn't expect this from you." The comment stung slightly. It carried traces of the same condescension she'd come to dread, but she chose to focus on the acknowledgement rather than the insult. He approved the project, assigning her lead responsibility for its execution. As the weeks went by, Emma threw herself into bringing the campaign to life. Challenges arose, of course, they always did, but she faced them head-on, drawing strength from the resilience she discovered within herself. Late nights turned into early mornings, coffee became her closest companion, and setbacks only fueled her determination to succeed. Meanwhile, subtle changes began occurring in the office dynamic. Colleagues who had previously dismissed her now sought her input, impressed by the creativity and dedication she brought to every task. Even Sarah started collaborating with her more frequently, offering insights that elevated their shared projects to new heights. For the first time, Emma felt like part of a team rather than an outsider struggling to fit in. Yet despite these victories, there remained a lingering tension between her and Mr. Harrison. While he acknowledged her growing competence, his demeanor toward her remained distant, almost guarded. Occasionally, she caught glimpses of regret in his eyes, fleeting moments when his gaze lingered a second too long or his words carried an unexpected softness, but he never addressed the incident directly. It was as though he hoped she'd forgotten, burying the memory beneath layers of professionalism. Emma, however, hadn't forgotten. Nor had she forgiven. The scars from his words still lingered, faint but present, reminding her of how far she'd come, and how much farther she intended to go. The day of the campaign launch arrived, bringing with it a whirlwind of anticipation and nerves. The entire office gathered in the conference room, eyes glued to the screen as the presentation unfolded. Emma stood at the front, guiding them through each segment, explaining the thought process behind every decision. As images flashed and videos played, murmurs of approval rippled through the crowd. When it concluded, applause erupted, filling the room with a warmth Emma hadn't expected. Mr. Harrison rose from his seat, clapping slowly, his expression unreadable. He approached her, extending a hand. "Well done," he said simply, his voice devoid of its usual sharpness. Emma hesitated before shaking it, unsure how to interpret the gesture. Was it genuine praise? Or merely a calculated attempt to smooth over past grievances? Before she could decide, he added, "You've proven yourself capable. Keep it up." With that, he turned and left the room, leaving her standing there, bewildered. Later that evening, as she packed up her things to leave, she found a note slipped beneath her keyboard. Scrawled in hurried handwriting were 3 words, "I owe you." There was no signature, but she didn't need one to know who it was from. For a moment, she considered confronting him, demanding an explanation, forcing him to acknowledge the harm he'd caused. But as she stared at the note, something shifted inside her. This wasn't about him anymore. It was about her. About the journey she'd taken to reclaim her confidence, her voice, her worth. Whatever remorse he felt, whatever lessons he'd learned, were his burden to carry, not hers. With a quiet resolve, Emma tucked the note into her bag and turned off the light. Outside, the city buzzed with life, oblivious to the battles fought and won within those office walls. As she stepped into the night, she realized something important. She wasn't the same person who'd walked out of that building weeks ago, broken and defeated. She was stronger now. Smarter. More determined than ever to carve out a future defined not by others' opinions, but by her own dreams. And yet, as she disappeared into the crowd, one question lingered in the air, unanswered. What would happen next? Would Mr. Harrison truly change, or were his words empty promises destined to fade with time? Only the days ahead would reveal the truth, but for now, Emma chose to focus on the path forward, trusting that she had the strength to face whatever lay ahead. The days following the campaign launch passed in a blur of activity. The project garnered attention not just within the company but also from clients and industry peers. Emails poured in praising Emma's innovative approach, and whispers of promotions began circulating among her colleagues. Yet, despite the external validation, Emma found herself grappling with conflicting emotions. On one hand, she felt triumphant. She had proven herself capable of greatness, even under the weight of doubt cast by someone she once respected. On the other hand, the note from Mr. Harrison lingered like an unresolved chord, leaving her unsure how to reconcile his apparent regret with the damage he'd inflicted. One afternoon, as Emma sat at her desk reviewing feedback on the campaign, Mr. Harrison appeared unexpectedly beside her. Startled, she looked up to find him standing there, hands shoved awkwardly into his pockets, his usual air of authority replaced by something softer, almost hesitant. "Got a minute?" he asked, his voice uncharacteristically subdued. Emma hesitated, then nodded, gesturing for him to take a seat across from her. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence stretched taut between them, heavy with unspoken words and lingering tension. Finally, Mr. Harrison exhaled sharply, running a hand through his graying hair. "I wanted to talk about what happened," he began, his gaze fixed somewhere over her shoulder rather than meeting her eyes. "That day in the meeting room." Emma stiffened, her fingers tightening around the pen she held. She hadn't expected this conversation, not so soon if ever. Part of her wanted to shut it down before it began, to tell him that some wounds couldn't be mended with apologies. But another part, the part that still believed in fairness, in redemption, urged her to listen. "What about it?" she replied coolly, keeping her tone neutral. He winced at her clipped response but pressed on. "I was wrong," he admitted, the words tumbling out quickly, as though saying them faster might make them hurt less. "What I said, it wasn't professional. It wasn't fair. And frankly, it wasn't true." Emma stared at him, searching his face for any sign of insincerity. His expression was earnest, his shoulders slumped as though carrying the weight of his guilt. Still, she remained guarded. Words were easy, actions mattered more. "You humiliated me in front of everyone," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside her. "You made me question everything I thought I knew about myself. Do you have any idea what that feels like?" Mr. Harrison flinched visibly, his jaw tightening. "I do," he said after a pause. "Because I've been there." Emma blinked, caught off guard. "What are you talking about?" He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. "When I was younger, before all this," he gestured vaguely at the office around them, "I worked under a boss who treated me the same way. He belittled me, dismissed my ideas, made me feel like I didn't belong. At the time, I told myself it was just tough love, that it would make me stronger. But looking back, I realize now how much it damaged me. How much anger and insecurity I carried because of it." Emma listened intently, her initial skepticism giving way to curiosity. This was a side of Mr. Harrison she'd never seen before, a vulnerability she hadn't imagined he possessed. "So why did you treat me the same way?" she asked, her voice tinged with both accusation and genuine curiosity. He sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. "Because I didn't know any better. Because somewhere along the line, I convinced myself that being hard on people was the only way to get results. I thought pushing you would bring out your best work. Instead," he trailed off, shaking his head. "Instead, I nearly drove you away." The honesty in his confession struck Emma deeply. It didn't erase the pain he'd caused, but it humanized him in a way she hadn't anticipated. She realized then that he wasn't just apologizing for his behavior, he was acknowledging his own flaws, his own failures. And perhaps in doing so, he was trying to break the cycle of toxicity he'd inherited. "I appreciate you saying all this," she said finally, choosing her words carefully. "But an apology doesn't undo what happened. Trust isn't something you can rebuild overnight." "I understand," he replied, nodding. "And I'm not asking for forgiveness, not yet anyway. All I'm asking is for a chance to prove that I can be better. That we can be better." Emma considered his words, weighing them against the months of frustration and self-doubt she'd endured. Could she give him that chance? More importantly, did she want to? Before she could respond, her phone buzzed on the desk, interrupting the moment. Glancing down, she saw an email notification from the CEO, subject, promotion announcement. Her stomach dropped. She opened the message, scanning its contents quickly. It was official. The success of the campaign had earned her a promotion to senior marketing strategist. A wave of pride washed over her, tempered by the realization that this milestone came with complications. Moving forward meant navigating a new dynamic with Mr. Harrison, one where their roles might shift further apart or closer together, depending on the choices they both made. "Well?" Mr. Harrison prompted, noticing her distracted expression. "What is it?" Emma hesitated, then turned the screen toward him. His eyes widened as he read the email, surprise flickering across his features. When he looked back at her, there was a mixture of admiration and something else, perhaps regret, perhaps envy, in his gaze. "Congratulations," he said sincerely. "You deserve it." For the first time since their fraught history began, Emma allowed herself to believe him. In the weeks that followed, subtle changes rippled through the office. Mr. Harrison seemed to soften, not just toward Emma but toward the entire team. Constructive criticism replaced cutting remarks, collaboration supplanted competition. Though skepticism lingered among some employees, others noted the shift with cautious optimism. As for Emma, she embraced her new role with quiet determination. Leading projects required not only skill but also diplomacy, patience, and empathy, qualities she'd honed during her journey to reclaim her confidence. She found herself mentoring junior staff, sharing lessons learned from her own struggles. In doing so, she discovered a sense of fulfillment that went beyond personal achievement. Yet, even as things improved, questions remained unanswered. Would Mr. Harrison's transformation endure, or was it merely a temporary facade? Could Emma truly forgive him, or would the scars of his words always linger beneath the surface? One evening, as she prepared to leave the office, Emma paused by the window overlooking the city skyline. Lights twinkled like stars scattered across the horizon, each one representing a story, a life, a dream. Somewhere out there, hers was unfolding too, a tapestry woven from resilience, growth, and the courage to rise above adversity. Behind her, footsteps approached. Turning, she saw Mr. Harrison standing in the doorway, holding 2 cups of coffee. "Thought you might need this," he said, offering her one of the cups. "Long day." Emma accepted it with a small smile, surprised by the gesture. As they stood side by side, sipping their drinks in companionable silence, she realized that while the road ahead wouldn't always be smooth, it held promise. Promise of healing, of understanding, of becoming more than either of them had been before. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. As they stood there, the weight of their shared history seemed to lift slightly, replaced by an unspoken truce. Emma realized forgiveness wasn't about forgetting, it was about choosing to move forward without letting bitterness anchor her to the past. Mr. Harrison broke the silence first. "You've changed things around here," he said softly. "For the better." Emma nodded, meeting his gaze. "We both have." The next morning, she walked into the office with a renewed sense of purpose, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Though scars remained, they no longer defined her. Instead, they reminded her of how far she'd come. And as she settled into her new role, leading with grace and determination, she knew one thing for certain: she was no longer the woman who'd once crumbled under harsh words. She had risen stronger, and nothing could take that away from her. The city lights still twinkled outside, but now, so did her future.